brick wall, so it's a very solid inside wall there. And the half in that direction is somewhat grander proportions. The rooms are bigger and so forth. But it all worked. He was obviously a very skilled architect, although he didn't call himself an architect. I assume he designed these things himself. And it was all very nicely done. And he did very good. When we bought the house, I had known the family, of course, all my life. And I think there were 21 heirs. So Bobby Walker was sort of the representative of the family. And he gave me a picture of the house, which we have hanging on the wall of the house as it was in about 1890. He also showed me some books. The old man kept very close tabs on the people working for him. And each bricklayer had, each day, the number of bricks he had laid that day were entered next to his name. And they used to lay 3,000 bricks a day. That's a lot of bricks. A brick weighs 5 pounds. So if you lifted 5 pounds, 3,000 days a day, your biceps and muscles are in good shape, if nothing else. And he was a very careful builder. I assume particularly when he was building for himself. And he also built the house across the street, 211 on 5th Street, for his foreman. And that is also well built.
How much did you buy this house for, and in what year?
This was $69,000, and it would have been I guess it was 1970, approximately.
And you had come back from Louisiana, right?
The carriage house and the stable in the back garden. It sounds like a hell of a buy now. And it was a pretty good buy then. But our accidental timing was very good, because within a couple of years after that, house inflation set in, and it has more or less continued off and on ever since. The house I was born in, which we still own down the block, my father bought for $6,000 in 1919. And I would say at this point, its sales price, we have no particular intention, we rent it out. It would sell, I would suspect, for $400,000. It's hard to, unless you put it up in the market, you wouldn't know, but that's roughly the ballpark as it is now. But of course, people like to act as if these were stationary figures. The $6,000 my father paid for it in 1919, if you consider inflation, it would probably be at least be 100,000 now. In other words, there has been an appreciation of value, but it hasn't been as crazy as it sounds. Of course, when you were buying something in 1919, you were paying the money you had, and if you were making $50 a week, you were well paid. That was a good job. So, again, all of that has to be taken into consideration. And the neighborhood itself, this particular block, the maid built a great many of the houses on this block, on the 5th Street around Warner, on next block of Constitution. And when I was a kid, Constitution was B Street Northeast, and Independence was B Street Southeast. And for some dramatic reason, along in the 30s, or so, they changed it to the avenues.
I heard this Constitution actually used to be a canal. Is that true?
No, it was a canal west of the Capitol, where the mall is. It was a very unsavory canal. It was obviously also polluted beyond pollution. And,
until when? Until when, do you know?
Oh, hard to say. Miss Rosalie Walker told me years and years and years ago that area right around here was called the Island. And it was called the Island because there was the Anacostia River to the south and the Potomac to the southwest. And the canal then had gone around like where the Union Station is now, is where it sort of disappeared. So there was, in a kind of a technical sense, it was more or less surrounded by water. And the area around the Union Station was known, and you still see references to it, as the Swamp Poodle, which it sounds like what it was, a swamp. Well, it was very wet, and that's where a great many of the Irish immigrants settled, in the Swamp Poodle, around the central point being St. Aloysius Church at North Capitol and I Street, the Jesuit institution. And as I say, the Swamp Poodle, it's even hard to define now. It was obviously went much further than the wet land behind the Union Station, before the Union Station had been built. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It spread around, as I say, out H Street and out North Capitol Street for several blocks. Mm-hmm. And my great aunt Selina Cribben lived, I think it was probably around 2nd and F Street Northwest. That was part of the Swamp Poodle. Mm-hmm.
So who do you know lives in this area now or in the recent past? I've heard John Ashcroft lives around here. Is that
well,
true?
This is I want to phrase this correctly because I don't want to sound somehow upside down snobbery. But the presence of congressmen, senators, and high government officials, most of them do not live on the hill, or never have, I would say. Probably more in the past. But this was no more remarkable to the ordinary people here than any town or city where the people that owned the factories would live someplace. In other words, were not inclined to boast to visitors that the guy who owned the mill lived a few blocks from you. You might, I don't know. But people were very casual. You didn't even know where the congressmen were. Nobody went around pointing it out. And as congressmen will, they came and went. So, of course, in the old days, particularly Southern congressmen tended to stay here for 30 or 40 years, so that they would be around for a while.
Like which ones do you know have lived around here?
Huh?
Which ones do you know have lived around here?
Right now, Senator Landry of Louisiana and her husband are building themselves a house 2 blocks on East Capitol between 5th and 6th. And Senator Breaux, also from Louisiana, lived up the block on 5th Street until a couple of years ago, and I think he still lives he sold the house and moved into an apartment. I think he still lives on the hill. And there used to be a couple of congressmen in the 300 block of Constitution. And I mean, it's Senator Domenici lives over on 2nd Street, I guess. And the late, very famous Senator Joseph McCarthy lived over on 2nd Street. So, as I say, you know that these people who live fairly close to us, if you lived over in Southeast, you might not, you might know, there might be a couple of congressmen you know over there, but it is not considered something. The Hill does a lot of boasting about itself. Champs, Capitol Hill, and Professional People Association, and that sort of. But they don't go. That is not the distinction that they put emphasis on. they're more likely to talk about the trees than they are about the congressman. And it's, again, the hill itself this is becoming more, it is becoming more acknowledged, I would say. When I was a kid, the hill was a label of convenience rather than anything else. Where did you live? You lived on Capitol Hill. And it was pretty much defined loosely as running from, say, Stanton Park, which is a block that way, to Garfield Park over in southeast and southwest, and from the Capitol grounds to 7th Street, where Eastern Market is. So, and that is now, I think, known among real estate people as the old hill or the traditional hill or some other designation. However, the real estate people in the 50s and 60s and so expanded the definition of Capitol Hill to go out past Lincoln Park. And this was houses on Capitol Hill, for whatever it was worth. However, it's much more in terms of the structures. It isn't that neat. The houses in the old hill are what I would call substantial, with a good scattering of rather impressive houses like this one. And up on East Capitol Street, there's several big, handsome houses with old bow windows and so forth. But there are also very substantial houses around Lincoln Park. That's still there. And so there were scatterings, not surprisingly, of what could be called upper income neighborhoods, a few blocks. And then there were less impressive buildings. A lot of the people who lived on the hill, the fathers worked as machinists in the Navy Yard, or printers in the printing office, government printing office. So it was always, in terms of income, it was a fairly wide range. You could grade all-inclusive class, included them all, but it was a big range. And there were very few rich people, for that matter, because the high officials, they certainly shouldn't become rich. So you don't have anything like Grosse Pointe or something around here. Although, you know, the Potomac, Maryland, for example, certainly has its pretensions. But back 50, 60 years ago, that was less true. And one of the neighborhoods that very few people have heard of, I suspect, it's called Pipe Town. This was an informal name, and it was out near the Navy Yard. That's where the Navy Yard was, a lot of them lived. And the name suggested it was not considered particularly swank. And it was the people who worked in the gas company had its tanks out there. And so that was called Pipe Town, around 11th Street. And, but also in those days, I think more than now, the sense of identity, neighborhood identity, was very sharply defined. In other words, the kids on this side of East Capitol Street didn't play with the kids on the other side of East Capitol Street. There wasn't any particular enmity, you just didn't know them. You stayed close to home. And it was the people outside of Stanton Park and other villages. So, why stay close to home? A lot of people had never been out of Washington. They spent their lives and in the traveling we did, my family, I had an aunt in New York City. We would go up there, and my aunt who was in a hospital in Baltimore, so we would go visit them, and so we were probably more travelers than most of my neighbors. Of course, a lot of people in Washington are great. I mean, came someplace else. So they would go back to Indiana once a year to visit their relatives. The travel was pretty much visiting relatives, I think.
How did your family become kind of literary and bent, or media bent, or
Well, they
something
were-
like
well,
that?
I had a cousin's cousin, Eddie Follard. I mentioned my great aunt Nellie Follard. Well, those Follards were the cousins of the other Follards. And he was sort of the star reporter on the Post and a couple of other papers, but mostly the Post for many years. And we were all proud to be connected to him. But I don't think there was any tradition. My father was an automobile mechanic who became a bar owner. And bar owning, if we had a family tradition, it was only ours. I think that there is, my mother was, she has a whole prayer book she won as a teenager for being the best scholar in Lissaculla. I would suspect that she might well have been a writer had she time to do any writing. But simply that, I think that you have a bent, and I became, outside of Eddie Follard, I was the first, I got a job as a copy boy on the Washington Post in 1939. And that was strictly just a summer job, and I had been working emptying freight cars for Sears Roebuck, which this was a much improvement to be a copy boy. This is the summertime job. And I then, one thing or another, I went in the Navy, and eventually the Navy sent me to college. And I was required to take the same curriculum that they had in Annapolis. But when we got to the juniors, I guess they said we could major in whatever we wanted to. And the simplest thing, the easiest thing to major in was journalism. And I had already been around newspapers, and it seemed to be a pretty nice way to earn a living. So I majored in journalism. And having done that, then I got a job on the Baton Rouge State Times. Then my kids, well, of course, I married Marty because I met her on a newspaper, New Orleans. And the kids grew up, most of our friends were newspaper people. So that was the world they were familiar with. And we'd have dinner parties, and people would sit around and talk about their trade, talk about shop. And I think those kids are greatly influenced by what is familiar. If your daddy is an architect, you probably at least give serious consideration to being an architect. I think jeans, I believe, at one point jeans were very unpopular. It was all environment. It was outrageous to suggest that anybody was born with an advantage. I think that's nonsense. And now the DNA people seem to have blown it out of the water. And not to talk about the writers in my family, of which there are a good many, but we had no discernible musical talent in my family. We just draw pictures all the time. Well, the grandchildren, Kate's two girls, and Meg's two children, have very clear musical talents, which they obviously got from their fathers. You know, there's no confusion in my mind. That's where it came from. And one of Kate's kids, little Marguerite, I would say, has a very pronounced graphic, artistic. But again, her mother, Kate, earned a living for a while drawing funny little pictures for the Washington Post and so forth. And her father, on the other hand, he is the art director for ABC in Washington. And I think there it is. It isn't that the old environmentalists would argue, well, you grow up and there's paintbrushes around the house. Because little Marguerite was showing an amazing graphic talent at the age of 2. And it couldn't have been because she was in an atmosphere. She just had a sense of color and form right then. You have it or you don't have it. And I think, fortunately for us, the children, our 4 children, all have, again, both Marguerite and I earned our living as writers. So it's not surprising. And Kate works for U.S. News and World Report, and Meg is writing scripts for soap operas, and Michael was our exhibit fellow. He's the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. And Nell, who is now teaching in a charter school and loves it, but she spent about 10 years as a film editor and worked on Cape Fear and the Kojaks and so on and so forth, which is an allied industry, you might say. So you are naturally familiar, you have the type of mind that feels at home with words, with manipulating words, with changing and so forth. Mm-hmm. And that's simply that. And I think the mark of a good society is one in which a child has an opportunity to pursue his natural talents. And the mark of a less good society is one, and there's a lot of them. You grow up in the hollows of Appalachia or something, you could have all kinds of talents that would go unrecognized because there was no market for them in that place. You know, I think things are improving. I think, that was much more the case 50 or 60 or 70 years ago than it is now, I think.
Do you want to give me a quick tour of the house?
Right. This is what Marguerite calls the morning room. That's a good name for it. So it's got an eastern exposure and the sun comes up in the morning, and it's got, as you can see, many windows, so there's opportunity for the used to have plaster ceilings, and when the automobile came along and the traffic increased, the plaster started cracking, and the major put in these pressed tin ceilings. So we have more pressed tin ceilings probably than anybody around. The hall still has its original plaster ceiling, and so it's a couple inches higher than the other ceilings.
This is a beautiful stained glass
arrangement
here. Is that
at
original?
One point people would take them down because they were considered old-fashioned and so forth. Now they're back in favor again. Mm-hmm. So nobody would take them down anymore. But they were very common. There's another one in the vestibule, the same sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And were you interested in this house because it was somewhat New Orleans-ish in
Marguerite was,
fashion?
because she grew up in beat up old big houses down in New Orleans. So it all seemed very familiar to her. It made her feel like at home. Mm-hmm. And in the site, the mark of security was having a big house. I mean, it might be falling apart, but at least you had a big house. And this is the.
Have you fixed it up a lot over time?
Very little, really. I mean, most of the changes have been like